Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well today. My name is Barbara Smith, and I'm the Vice President for Peace Programs here at the Carter Center. And it is my distinct pleasure and honor to welcome you to what promises to be a full and interesting day of discussions on restoring confidence in America's elections. The Carter Center could not have asked for a better partner in thinking through and hosting these events than Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Our partnership with the Baker Institute builds on the work and spirit of collaboration that President Carter and Secretary Baker modeled so well when they co-chaired the Commission on Federal Election Reform in 2005, as well as on their personal camaraderie, leadership, and integrity. Today's event is the first of two hybrid convenings that the Carter Center and the Baker Institute will co-host, and it builds on a series of webinars that we co-organized last year in 2021 to reflect on electoral developments in the years since President Carter and Secretary Baker co-chaired the 2005 Bipartisan Election Reform Commission. If any of you did not get a chance to watch the events last year, we hope you will watch the recordings, which are currently on our websites. While the Carter Center and the Baker Institute are both strictly nonpartisan, we have tried in our joint initiative to honor the legacy of our founders and leaders by highlighting the importance of meaningful bipartisan discussion and debate about election reform. Through these discussions, we have found that when we focus on processes and procedures related to access and integrity and put voters first in our thinking about elections, there are more points of agreement than not. We also have tried to highlight the voices of those who know and understand our elections process the best. The election administrators who work in some 10,000 electoral jurisdictions across these United States. Today's discussion reflects that commitment. You will hear from election administrators and experts from around the country who bring a wealth of experience that can help us better understand the questions we will address today. In particular, the sessions today will examine, first, whether and how a U.S. presidential election could be stolen. Second, whether we should be worried about our elections. And third, what is happening at the state level with legislation, audits, and other developments. We also hope that this will be a conversation, and we encourage both those here in person as well as those participating online to ask questions and engage with our panelists. We'll share a little bit more about how this will all work a little bit later. But let me now welcome to the podium the Carter Center CEO and my boss, Paige Alexander, who will share a few opening remarks to set the stage for today's conversation. Paige, over to you. Thanks.
Hi, thank you, Barbara, and I want to welcome you in joining everybody that we have here. Got a little height on you. Welcome everybody that we have joining us here, as well as all of those online and all over the world. I want to give a special thanks to the Carter Center staff for the Democracy Programs and Conflict Resolution, who have put this on together with the Baker Institute. This is our first in-person conference that we have done since I became CEO in June 2020. So just nothing like seeing warm food out there and friendly faces in here, so thank you. I can think of truly no better hybrid event for us to start with than after the pandemic changes, than discussing the restoration of confidence in American elections. So as Barbara mentioned, in 2005, President Carter and former Secretary Baker co-chaired the Bipartisan Commission for Federal Election Reform. This commission had Republicans and Democrats. We had members from election administrators and elected officials and experts and others. And they reached a broad consensus on recommendations on a range of issues related to election reform. Some of these were quite controversial at the time, voter ID, for example, and others have received heightened attention over the years, specifically related to absentee ballots. So to set the scene, this commission began its work after the 2000 election. Many of us remember that election, the hanging chads, the dimpled chads, the butterfly bullets. All of these issues were what was, for us, a question about election integrity. And as we waited 36 very long days to figure out who the next president of the United States was going to be, we really were in what we thought at that time was a crisis mode. And so the work of the commission at that time was squarely focused on the issues of confidence in our election. And the foreword to the report said, elections are the heart of our democracy. They are the instrument for the people to choose leaders and hold them accountable. At the same time, elections are a core public function upon which all of government responsibilities depend. If elections are defective, the entire democracy system is at risk. Americans are losing confidence in the fairness of our elections, and while we do not face a crisis today, we need to address the problems of electoral reform. So while President Carter and Secretary Baker were concerned at the time about declining confidence in our elections, I think it's fair to say that they truly did not anticipate the severity of our crisis that we have today. So in 2005, Americans' confidence in our democratic institutions and in the honesty and integrity of the elections had declined precipitously. Americans on both the left and the right, for different reasons, increasingly questioned the legitimacy of the outcome of the election. The bellwether of what we, especially at the Carter Center, see in elections in 40 different countries around the world, see as the very core of our democracy. As an example, in July 2021, PBS NewsHour Marist poll found that a staggering 83% of Republicans reported believing that American democracy is under threat. The loss of confidence in elections has been exacerbated by a number of factors. Some of these are unique to the United States, and they also reflect larger global trends. It's important to understand these factors, and the ones that are unique to the United States, especially compared to international standards of those of other democracies. There's serious structural gaps for a few countries to have anything resembling an electoral college system. And although that was part of the grand compromise that allowed for the creation of our democracy, it is not something that you see elsewhere. It runs contrary to equal suffrage, and since it increases the relative weight of the vote cast in states with smaller populations, and in several instances has resulted in the election of candidates who did not win the popular vote. And of course, everyone's aware of the negative impacts of gerrymandering on representation. Meanwhile, in other countries, they wonder why the United States lacks the type of standard and easily accessible voter identification required in many countries. So in addition to our system of campaign finance, especially dark money, which allows special interests to have a significant influence on campaigns and can make it extremely difficult to pass broadly popular reforms and can make these legislations that Americans support and deserve could make it better. Finally, the heightened 2005 Carter-Baker Commission report, the U.S. has a highly unusual approach to election administration, where election administrators are often elected on partisan tickets, an approach that makes the United States quite the outlier. So the decrease in Americans' confidence in democracy and election also reflects the perceptions and the trends prevalent in many parts of the world. As an example, the Democracy Perception Index is a survey conducted by Latina and the Alliance for Democracies across 53 countries, and it focuses on some of the key issues related to public perception of democracy. Half of those polled said that unfair elections threaten democracy in their country. The most confident folks are in Denmark, the citizens of Denmark, even though 25% of them are also concerned. And Nigeria tops the rankings with a very large majority feeling that unfair elections undermine their democracy. So the US is right in the middle of this pack. About half of Americans say that unfair elections threaten democracy. And we know from other studies that this feeling is significantly impacted by whether the candidate or party you vote won in the last election. So around the world, democracies are struggling to determine the appropriate response to an onslaught of mis, dis, and malinformation. And that makes it difficult to often tell fact from fiction, and particularly when used as a political weapon or a tool of foreign interference. We have it both in the US and in many countries around the world. We know what can happen when the lack of trust in institutions, disinformation, and longer-term societal inequities coalesce together. Among other things, the potential for violence increases. And here I think it's important to point out not just the type of violence that we're referring to when we talk about January 6th, but in addition, we also mean smaller, widespread individual acts like harassment of and intimidation and threat of election administrators. And these are people who, in many cases, volunteer. And they are trying to help us do our civic duty, and they have been threatened and harassed. In a report issued by the Brennan Center for Justice and the Bipartisan Center last year, 1 in 6 election officials polled expressed some sort of harassment and threat. I'll say it again, 1 in 6 of people trying to uphold our democratic ability to vote and essentially the core of what we do many times in our lifetime. So in this context, it was in this context that in 2020, the Carter Center decided for the first time in its history to engage at activities aimed at improving elections in this country. I had started in June 2020. I arrived from Europe, was greeted at the airport with CDC, totally covered in PPE, asking if I had been to Iran or China because we were at the height of the pandemic. I drove down Peachtree Street and saw the aftermath of the protest, which is particularly poignant since today is the 30th anniversary of what people saw with Rodney King in California 30 years later. And I got to my parents' house where I saw Lafayette Square being tear-gassed. This was my return to Atlanta. This was my return to the United States. And I went down to Plains and I talked to President Carter. And I said, we have to get involved. We can't do this in 113 elections overseas and not look in our own backyard. And he absolutely agreed and said, be bold. And I think a lot of that was based on the 2005 bipartisan commission that he and Secretary Baker agreed to do together. So most of the world still looks at the United States as an example for democracy and relies on it to be a leading advocate. And this is the space that we want to hold. So given the scale of the problems, we hope to accomplish here together today and a discussion about the legacy of President Carter, Secretary Baker, and other members of that 2005 commission. So first and foremost, we hope that the conversation today will answer some questions that all of us have about elections that are on our mind. As Barbara noted, we are thrilled to have leading experts on election administration from around the country with us today to share in your expertise and answer a few questions. Second, we hope to build on the bipartisan leadership of 2 senior statespersons and skilled negotiators. I would say negotiators who, mind you, had previously turned their attention to the Middle East, and now we're looking back in 2005 at our own elections. And they came together to tackle the crisis and the confidence of elections in the service to the American interest. So in the PBS NewsHour interview that following the release of the 2005 Commission report, Secretary Baker said in response to a question asked about whether the 2000 election had caused any awkwardness between the two of them. And Secretary Baker said, none whatsoever. For me, these are issues here that President Carter and I might not completely agree with, and there are serious issues here that I don't completely agree with, but there's been a lot of compromise to get this report together. And to which President Carter's response was, it was a harmonious relationship as you could ever possibly imagine. So I quote this to highlight that both President Carter and Secretary Baker recognized the differences of opinions about election administration and that need not divide us, and that trying to reach agreement wherever possible is essential to bolstering trust in our elections and ultimately the confidence of our democracy. Of course, President Carter and Secretary Baker were not the last people to try to demonstrate the potential and importance of bipartisan cooperation. We're very fortunate here to have today with us Ben Ginsburg and Bob Bauer, who together co-chaired the 2013-2014 Presidential Commission on Election Administration, and who continue to work together across the U.S., as I've seen you all on the road show, to talk about the challenges facing elections and election administrators through their work as part of the Election Official Legal Defense Network. So we're thrilled to have you here today. I'd like to close by extending a deep and sincere thanks to David Becker, the Center for Election Innovation and Research, who has been an incredible thought leadership participant with us in pulling this together with the Baker Institute. And of course, we are extremely thankful for our partnership with the Baker Institute and Secretary Baker. John Williams and Mark Jones have been steadfast colleagues in our work together, and we're looking forward to working with them as they host this gathering next year. So I spoke to President Carter earlier in the week, and he was reminiscing fondly about his time working with Secretary Baker, a man who he has the utmost respect for. And he always worries, as he says to me, "You're going to spend all my money as we start new projects, especially domestically." And as I say back to him, there's no price of democracy. So I am pleased that you are here joining us today, and I look forward to the conversation, and I'd like to welcome John to the stage. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for that nice introduction. I want to ad-lib real quickly. It's the harmonious relationship that President Baker referred to is really alive and well. It's been a joy to work, Paige, with you and Barbara, David, Avery, and the rest of the people at the Carter Center. Thank you so much. It's great to be here at the center named after one of the finest men in American history. President Carter's continued contributions to our country and the world remain a beacon of optimism, goodwill, and hope. He's really quite a guy. Secretary Baker asked me to share just a few very brief remarks this morning. First, he's pleased that the Carter Center and the Baker Institute are continuing the collaboration that he and President Carter shared when they co-chaired the Bipartisan Commission on Presidential Election Reform. The Commission's report provided a critical blueprint for improvements in the way our elections are conducted, including the siren call for a verified voter paper trail to back up electronic voting. Such paper trail that Georgia subsequently established provided evidence that the final 2020 election results in this state were valid. Second, Secretary Baker understands that change is the only constant in politics and policy. With that in mind, there will always be the need to fine-tune the administration of elections and make sure that voters have confidence in the result. Such confidence is a critical component of our democracy, and none of us can allow that to wane. And third, as nations, states, and local governments move forward with reforms, Secretary Baker believes that we should all remember this simple paradigm. Not everything Democrats propose is an effort to steal votes. But by the same token, not everything Republicans propose is an attempt to suppress the vote. Ladies and gentlemen, Secretary Baker strongly believes that we must always work together to identify problems in this country and figure out how to solve them. Above all, we cannot allow compromise to remain the dirty word that sadly it's become. Compromise is essential to getting the people's business done. I know that all of us with the Carter Center and the Baker Institute hope that today's conference can further that collaborative spirit, that harmonious relationship that President Carter and Secretary Baker demonstrated 17 years ago. Thank you so much, and now I welcome David Becker to the stage. And thank goodness for his horsepower. We all appreciate it, David.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Paige. As they mentioned, I'm David Becker. I'm the executive director and founder of the nonpartisan nonprofit Center for Election Innovation and Research in Washington, D.C. As we sit here today, we are 543 days since the November 2020 election. You can check my math. By any measure, that election was the most secure, transparent, scrutinized, and verified election in American history. There were more paper ballots cast than ever before in American history, including every ballot pretty much in every battleground state, with the exception of a small number of disability-accessible ballots. And that includes the state here of Georgia, where for the first time in decades, they had paper ballots statewide. We had more audits of those ballots than ever before. 43 states and DC conducted audits, perhaps most famously again here in Georgia, where 5.5 million paper ballots were counted entirely by hand to confirm the outcome of the presidential race. In fact, those presidential ballots were counted 3 times here in Georgia, 3 different ways, confirming the results every time. We had more pre-election litigation than ever before to set the rules so that both sides knew what rules were in place. Both sides won some, both sides lost some, but they knew what the rules were when we went into Election Day. And there was more post-election litigation confirming the results than ever before. And that was even followed up by some of the partisan investigations, which we're going to hear about a little bit later, that occurred, some are recurring even now. And every single one of them has failed to find any evidence of widespread fraud, and every single one of them has confirmed the results. Think back now on what we achieved in 2020. We somehow managed an election where 20 million more Americans voted than in any election in American history. 20 million. We had the highest turnout by number, and we had the highest turnout by percentage since universal suffrage. 2/3 of all eligible voters. We did this while election officials were under-resourced and under stress in the middle of a global pandemic. This was the greatest achievement in the history of American democracy. It's something we should be applauding. I've worked in elections for a quarter century, and I still get emotional thinking about it. And yet, there still remain doubts. The professionalism of the men and women who ran elections during a global pandemic was remarkable. And that professionalism is higher now than it's ever been, and that's largely due to a lot of people in this room. It's due to the work of the Carter-Baker Commission. It's due to the work of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration, co-chaired by Bob Bauer and Ben Ginsberg, who you hear later today. And yet still, as Paige mentioned, a large majority of Republicans believe the exact opposite of the truth and don't recognize the tremendous success we achieved because they disagree with the outcome. We all have to get back to a place, I think, and I think the people in this room are already there, where we can defend the integrity of elections in which our candidate loses. That's really at the core of American democracy. I'm incredibly grateful for the leadership of the Carter Center and the Baker Institute and all of their staffs for leading this effort. There are few statesmen as credible, as great as Secretary Baker and President Carter, and lending their credibility to this effort over years and years has been incredibly important. I know this from the work that I've done. So I'm looking forward to a really good conversation today. We're going to get into some of the more of these issues as we go through the rest of the day. And with that, I will hand it over to David Carroll, the director of the Democracy Program here at the Carter Center.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, David. Thank you, John. Thank you, Paige. Thank you, Barbara. If I can welcome the panelists to the stage here, I'm going to introduce the panelists in just a moment, but just make a couple of quick logistical housekeeping points before we get started. Again, I'm David Carroll, director of the Democracy Program. We will be going for about an hour and a half in this first panel, and the question before the panel that they'll be discussing is, can a presidential election be stolen? If you have questions in the audience, if you're here, you've got little index cards by your desks there. During the course of this session, we'll have Carter Center staff around, and so they'll pick them up from time to time, so just look for folks, and they'll be brought up to the moderator who will pose questions directly to them through the cards. If you're participating online, through the online chat, you can also submit questions. The online chat moderator will get those to us. We'll get them to the moderator here, and so those questions can also be heard. We apologize in advance if we don't get to all of your questions, but we know that we will be doing the best we can. If you're on social media, please feel free to use hashtag #ElectionConfidence to let people know what you're hearing and learning at today's events. And let's see, last logistical item, restrooms. So out these doors to the left, and you can go either upstairs or downstairs, and you will find what you need for restrooms. So with that, I'm going to introduce today's panelists. Thank you all for being here. First, and I'll do them brief introductions. You have full bio information and the materials in front of you and online, but I'll just say a couple of very quick introductory remarks. So we have Natalie Adona. Natalie is the Assistant Clerk Recorder and the Registrar of Voters for Nevada County, California. She's a deputy member of the California Association of Clerks and Election Officials, where she currently serves as the chair of the Constitution and Bylaws Committee and co-chair of the Ballot Design Advisory Committee. She's also a member of the County Recorders Association of California. Welcome, Natalie. Thanks. Matt Masterson. Matt is the Director of Information Integrity at Microsoft, and he was formerly the non-resident policy fellow with the Stanford Internet Observatory. Prior to that, he was senior cybersecurity advisor at the Department of Homeland Security, focusing on election security. He also served as a commissioner at the Election Assistance Commission from 2014 to 2018, and was the commission's chairman in 2017 and 2018. He also worked with the Ohio Secretary of State's office. Welcome, Matt. Glad to have you here. Al Schmidt. Since 2002, Al has been the president and CEO of the Committee of 70, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization focused on good government, strengthening democracy, and combating political corruption. Before that, he was the city commissioner of Philadelphia for 10 years and one of 3 members on the bipartisan board of elections, serving as the vice chairman. Welcome, Al. And lastly, as our moderator this morning, we have Major Garrett. Hello, Major. Since December 2018, Major has been the CBS News chief Washington correspondent, where he reports for all CBS News broadcasts and platforms. He's also the host of The Takeout. It's a weekly multi-platform interview show on politics, policy, pop culture on CBSN and radio stations across the country and podcast platforms. So with that, Major, it's over to you.